The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects as Rachel Torres moved through Sacred Heart's ICU with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from having triaged wounds under mortar fire. 3 days on the job and nobody had asked her name beyond what the badge said. Nobody noticed the way her hands moved without hesitation, without the tentative searching of someone still learning hospital protocols. She'd been doing this for longer than most of the permanent staff had been alive. She checked the monitors in Bay 7 first. Elderly male, post-op cardiac, oxygen sat holding at 92%. Good. The foredrip was running at the prescribed rate, but the bag would need changing in approximately 4 hours. She made a mental note, the kind of memory that came from keeping people alive in places that didn't exist on any map. The chart noted the defibrillator in his room as a model from 2019 with full certification. Rachel knew better. She'd seen the invoice log on the supply closet door. That unit was from 2009. The serial number didn't match. She photographed it with her phone, quietly, efficiently, the way you document inconsistencies when you've learned that details save lives. The antiseptic smell of the ICU had once made her nauseous. Now it was just the smell of work. She moved to Bay 9, where a woman recovering from pneumonia surgery rested uneasily in the pre-dawn darkness. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and reliable. Rachel adjusted the flow rate by 1%, watching the oxygen saturation climb from 88 to 91. The trembling wasn't in her hands when she did this work. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. The trembling came later, in the break room, when nobody was watching. She'd been working the night shift for 72 hours straight, picking up extra hours to keep the rent paid on the studio apartment in Montrose where she'd been invisible for 3 months. Temp assignment, no questions asked, no background check that would trigger the redacted files, the classified markers, the government notation that said she'd never existed in the first place. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, Navy Special Warfare, officially erased from every database that mattered. Here at Sacred Heart she was just another nurse filling gaps in the schedule, someone the administration would forget by next quarter. The break room was empty at 0400 hours. Rachel poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting for 6 hours, the kind of burnt bitterness that tasted like every field hospital she'd ever worked in. She didn't flinch at the taste. Pain was information. Everything was information. The frayed cuff of her scrub jacket shifted as she lifted the cup, and for just a moment the torn lining gaped open. There. The faded unit patch, olive drab with a trident insignia, sewn into the seam 22 years ago by a quartermaster in Coronado. She adjusted the jacket quickly, but not quickly enough. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway, watching her from the shadows of the hallway. He had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, the practiced confidence of a man who'd built an entire financial operation on the assumption that nobody was paying attention. He'd been at Sacred Heart for 14 years, long enough to cultivate the right relationships, the right board members, the right pharmaceutical liaisons. PharmaCorp had been funneling him $240,000 annually for 3 years now, all routed through shell companies, all documented just carefully enough to survive a cursory audit. Outdated equipment billed as new. Expired inventory rotated and resold. Unnecessary procedures recommended to high-value patients. It was a delicate system that required one thing above all else, compliance from staff who didn't ask questions. Rachel Torres was asking questions. Hargrove had noticed it on day 1. The way she'd reviewed the equipment logs in the supply closet. The way she'd cross-referenced the defibrillator serial numbers against the maintenance records. The way her eyes moved across the invoices as if she were reading a map of something he'd deliberately obscured. This morning she'd spent 14 minutes examining the billing codes on the previous week's cardiac procedures, making notes on a small pad she carried in her jacket pocket. He'd watched from the 2nd floor, calculating the threat. A temp nurse with military-grade attention to detail was exactly the kind of person who destroyed fortunes. Not through dramatics or accusations, but through documentation. Through quiet, methodical observation. Through the kind of meticulous record-keeping that got presented in conference rooms with irrefutable evidence. Hargrove had built his entire position on the assumption that people were either complicit or incompetent. Rachel Torres appeared to be neither. He didn't approach her. Not yet. That would come later, once he'd secured his leverage. For now, he simply observed as she set down the coffee cup with the precise care of someone who'd learned not to waste anything, not to make unnecessary noise, not to draw attention unless it was unavoidable. She wore scrubs one size too large, the kind of loose fit that screamed temporary worker trying to be invisible. But her posture was wrong for invisible. Her posture was wrong for a nurse at all. It was the posture of someone accustomed to carrying weight, to shouldering responsibility, to being the last person standing between disaster and survival. Hargrove made a decision in that moment. His jaw tightened, a small movement that would have meant nothing to anyone watching, but to himself it meant everything. This woman had to go. Not immediately. Not obviously. But systematically, efficiently, the way you removed any threat to a carefully constructed system. He would build a case. He would document her insubordination, her questioning of protocols, her challenge to established authority. And if she didn't resign voluntarily, when she didn't resign, he would ensure that her termination was thorough and permanent. He turned and walked away, leaving Rachel alone with her burnt coffee and her faded unit patch and her 3 decades of experience doing impossible things under impossible conditions. The rest of the shift passed in the blur of constant vigilance that Rachel had learned to sustain without thinking. She checked vitals every hour. She reviewed fluid intake and output with the precision of someone who understood that 3 milliliters of difference could mean the progression from stable to crisis. She adjusted medications with the kind of careful attention that suggested she wasn't just following orders but understanding the biochemistry behind them. At 08 for 7 hours, she noticed that one of the peripheral full lines in Bay 12 had developed infiltration, fluid leaking into the surrounding tissue. She documented it, flagged it for the attending physician, and had it corrected before it could become a problem. The resident doctor, Marcus Chen, looked at her with surprise. "How did you catch that?" he asked. "It's barely visible." "Experience," Rachel said. The word was neutral, professional, revealing nothing. She was good at revealing nothing. She'd spent 3 tours in operations across the Middle East learning to keep her face blank and her voice steady and her hands ready for whatever came next. "Well, good catch," Chen said. He didn't press for more. Most people didn't. They saw a temp nurse doing temp work and made assumptions that didn't require further investigation. The morning shift came on at 0700 hours, and Rachel handed off her patients with meticulous notes. She made sure every detail was documented, every change in condition noted, every concern flagged. This was the work of someone who understood that information saved lives, that precision mattered, that the small details were often the difference between a patient going home and a patient not making it through the week. At 0815 hours, while Rachel was updating the supply inventory, another task that had revealed inconsistencies she found troubling, Hargrove was in his office making phone calls. The first was to his contact at PharmaCorp. The second was to the hospital's director of human resources. The third was to a colleague at another major medical center in Houston who owed him a favor from a previous business arrangement. "I may have a staffing situation," Hargrove said to the HR director. "The new temp nurse in the ICU. I want to keep a close eye on her performance. Document everything. She's been asking questions about supply protocols that go beyond her scope as a float nurse." It wasn't a lie. It was just not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Rachel Torres had the kind of attention to detail that threatened a revenue stream worth $360,000 annually. The whole truth was that she posed an existential threat to his carefully constructed system. And the whole truth was that Hargrove had already decided she was expendable. What he didn't know, what nobody at Sacred Heart knew, was that Rachel Torres had been trained in environments where the stakes were measured in human lives, where accuracy could mean the difference between an extraction team making it home and adding names to a memorial wall. She'd been trained by the best military medicine had to offer. She'd seen what happened when people in positions of authority prioritized profit over protocol. She'd seen it before. And she was watching it happen again. The $50 bet started at 6:24 a.m. in Sacred Heart's cafeteria, where Dr. Hargrove stood with 6 physicians clustered around his corner table like courtiers waiting for judgment. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above them. Hargrove's voice carried the practiced confidence of a man who'd never heard the word no from anyone who mattered. "Gentlemen, I'll wager $50 our temp nurse quits by Friday," he said, stirring his coffee with a silver spoon that caught the light. "She doesn't have the spine for real medicine." The laughter came easy. These were his people, attending physicians with malpractice insurance and reputations he'd protected, board members whose equipment contracts depended on his recommendations, residents who understood that challenging Hargrove meant residency ending. Kenneth Roth, the orthopedic surgeon with the Rolex, leaned back in his chair. "What makes you so certain?" "Because I've already started pushing," Hargrove said. His teeth showed white when he smiled. "Watch." Rachel pushed through the cafeteria doors at 6:52 a.m. with her lunch tray balanced on one hand. She wore her scrubs like armor, faded blue, wrinkled from a 14-hour shift at another hospital before clocking in here at midnight. The torn lining of her jacket was visible near the left shoulder, where the faded unit patch was stitched just out of sight. She moved through the cafeteria the way she moved through the ICU, efficient, purposeful, acknowledging nothing. Hargrove's voice cut through the ambient chatter. "Nurse Nightingale. Tell us, did they teach you how to read a chart at whatever community college you attended?" The assembled physicians turned to watch. This was theater. This was how institutional power confirmed itself. Rachel set her tray down on an empty table and didn't respond. "I asked you a question, sweetheart." Hargrove stood now, and the room's attention crystallized around him. "When I speak to you, the professional courtesy is to answer." She took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened, just barely visible, just enough for someone trained to read combat stress to notice. She turned to face him. Lifted her eyes to his without flinching. "I learned chart review from doctors who could teach and practice medicine at the same time, Dr. Hargrove." The silence that followed was the kind that settles after a statement has been made and cannot be unmade. Hargrove's smile vanished. His hands went still. The other physicians exchanged glances, uncertain whether this was still amusing, whether boundaries had just been crossed, whether they were watching insubordination or competence. Rachel picked up her tray and ate alone at a corner table. No one joined her? By mid-morning, Hargrove had escalated. He found her in the medication room updating a patient's for protocol when he arrived with 3 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. His movements were deliberate. He picked up her carefully organized charts, color-coded by patient, flagged with specific dosage corrections she'd identified during her 2 a.m. rounds, and dropped them. Paper scattered across the floor like snow. The crash echoed through the narrow hallway. "Sloppy work, Torres. We have standards here." His voice was loud enough for 3 different departments to hear. A nurse nearby gasped. Rachel knelt without hesitation, collecting pages with hands that didn't shake. Medical charts had cost $847 in preparation materials, paper, ink, the time to cross-reference protocols. They would cost nothing now, crumpled on an antiseptic floor. She gathered them methodically. "Standards are why I'm correcting the dosage errors from this morning, sir." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It was the voice of someone who'd made statements under worse circumstances than this. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His hand went to his stethoscope as if touching something familiar would restore his authority. "You don't correct attending physicians. The patient's medication order has a 400 milligram discrepancy from her post-op protocol," Rachel said, standing with the gathered charts. "I flagged it for your review." She walked past him to file the charts. The residents parted like water. Hargrove watched her go, and his expression hardened into something colder than anger, something like calculation. That afternoon in the crowded cafeteria, Rachel carried her tray past Hargrove's table. The cafeteria was at peak capacity, 14 physicians, 20 nurses, 30 support staff. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped wasps. Hargrove extended his foot slightly, just an inch into her path. The geometry was perfect. Inevitable. The tray crashed to the floor. Soup sprayed. The sandwich skidded under a table. Utensils clattered across tile like gunshots. The cafeteria went dead silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. The kitchen staff froze. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Hargrove picked up a patient file from his table, M. Hayes, post-operative status, room 347, and threw it at her feet. The file scattered, pages falling around the puddle of soup. His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd finally confirmed his power over someone who couldn't fight back. Pick that up, sweetheart. Seems you're better at cleaning than nursing. Rachel stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Everyone watched. This was the moment. This was where a temp nurse, someone with no tenure, no reputation, no institutional weight, would break. This was where she would cry or rage or resign. This was where power confirmed itself by destroying the powerless. Rachel took one measured breath. Her eyes didn't water. But a single tear escaped anyway, not from fear or humiliation but from something else entirely. Something like restraint. Something like rage held back by a wire no thicker than a human hair. The tear tracked down her cheek slowly, deliberately, as if her body was demonstrating something her voice wouldn't say. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice was steady as a heartbeat. I've cleaned up worse messes from better men. She knelt and retrieved the file. Her hands didn't shake. She stacked the scattered pages methodically, gathered them in order, vitals first, admission notes, surgical report, post-op imaging. She stood, holding the file. The cafeteria remained silent. Every physician at Hargrove's table was now studying their food. No one made eye contact with him. Rachel walked to the trash receptacle and discarded her lunch, tray, napkin, and dignity that wasn't hers to give up. She filed the scattered pages of Hayes's chart in their proper place. She clocked back into the ICU at 1:03 p.m., where 14 patients required monitoring and one of them had just woken up. In room 347, Sergeant Marcus Hayes regained consciousness for the first time since surgery. His eyes opened slowly. Anesthesia withdrawal took 20 minutes. That was the window when neural pathways came back online, when muscle memory reactivated, when the brain began reasserting control over the body. For Hayes, those 20 minutes included exactly 47 seconds when he heard her voice. Good afternoon, Sergeant. You're in Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston. Surgery went well. No complications. Her voice came from just outside his peripheral vision. Medical, professional, steady. The voice of a trained provider. The voice of someone who'd given similar speeches 400 times before. His body knew that voice before his conscious mind did. His heart rate spiked. The monitor above his bed beeped once. Twice. His pupils dilated. Everything, every cell, every memory encoded in his nervous system, recognized something that couldn't possibly be here. She stepped into his line of sight. 42 years old. Tattoo on her left inner wrist, coordinates that meant something to people who'd been places no map showed. Eyes the color of flint. Her jacket was slightly torn along the left shoulder, and through that tear, visible for just a moment as she leaned to check his was a patch. Faded from 20 years. Stitched along its edge with careful precision. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Unit designation. The patch he'd clutched as a terrified 6-year-old boy pulled from Sanjin rubble. The patch the woman had worn when she'd shielded his small body with her own as the secondary explosion ripped through the school compound. The patch that had been the last thing he saw before darkness took him, her, pressed against his back, her voice in Pashto, in English, I've got you, baby. I've got you. Hayes's breath came shallow. 20 years. 2 decades of growing up in military bases, of following his rescuer's invisible path, of joining special forces because he wanted to understand what kind of woman shields a child with her own body when explosions are happening. 20 years of wondering if she was real or trauma memory, if the woman was still alive, if she remembered. The monitors showed his vitals accelerating. Rachel checked his BP, 140/92, elevated. His oxygen saturation rising. Sergeant Hayes? Talk to me. Are you in pain? He couldn't speak. His throat had closed. His hands trembled, actually trembled, something that hadn't happened in combat, in training, in any emergency he'd faced. She was real. She was here. She was standing 3 feet away, and she had no idea that she'd changed the trajectory of his entire life. Rachel adjusted his fall with the precision of someone who'd made 10,000 such adjustments, and in that moment, moving with muscle memory that transcended 2 decades, Hayes understood something. He understood why he'd become what he'd become. Why he'd spent 12 years training to be useful, to be capable, to be ready. He understood that he was awake not by accident but by design, that somewhere in the randomness of hospital assignments and surgical schedules and his decision to get this particular shrapnel removed, the universe had arranged a reckoning. She didn't recognize him. That was clear. But he recognized her. And she had no idea what was about to change. But that wasn't the worst part for Rachel. As she left room 347, she didn't hear Hargrove on the phone in the surgical lounge, didn't see him pressing the phone to his ear with the expression of a man confirming his institutional power. "Yes, I'll hold for board member Wallace," he said quietly. "I need to discuss the temp nurse. I have concerns about her credentials. Day 4 at Sacred Heart, and Sergeant Hayes should have been improving. Post-op vital stable. Drainage tubes functioning. The kind of recovery trajectory that makes nurses check boxes and move to the next room." But at 2 p.m. hours, everything stopped being routine. Rachel was finishing a chart outside room 347 when the monitor alarm split the corridor like a knife. Not the soft warning beep of a trending issue. The full staccato panic of a body in crisis. She didn't run. Running drew attention. But her pace shortened the distance between 2 heartbeats, and she was through the door before the first nurse even looked up from her desk. Hayes lay gasping, his body rigid with the animal panic of someone who couldn't breathe. His neck veins distended like hydraulic hoses. His trachea visibly deviated. Skin the color of wet concrete. Rachel's eyes catalogued every detail in the 3 seconds it took her to reach the bed, the slight hyperresonance on the left side of his chest when she glanced at his position, the asymmetrical breath sound she could hear even without a stethoscope, the collapse of his right lung under pressure that was building inside his thoracic cavity like a bomb with no release valve. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung forcing air into the space between his lungs and chest wall, compressing the other lung, pushing his heart toward the right. Every breath made it worse. Without intervention, he'd arrest in minutes. "Get the crash cart," Rachel said to the floor nurse, a young woman named Collins who stood frozen at the foot of the bed, watching Hayes' oxygen saturation plummet on the monitor. 78, 71, 63, now. "And call for the attending." "We have to wait for the trauma team," Collins said, her voice trembling. "Protocol says we need to." Rachel was already moving, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she pulled the trauma pen from her scrub pocket, a habit from another life, kept there for the exact kind of moment when protocols became graveyards and waiting became a luxury nobody could afford. The pen was battered, its metal casing dull with age, the needle still secured inside. She'd carried it through 3 continents. She'd used it twice. Both times, people lived. "They're 2 floors away," Rachel said. "He has 90 seconds. She palpated his chest, finding landmarks the way a pilot finds stars. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her fingers marked the intersection like a surgeon reading a map. The anatomy was simple. Brutal. Precise. Hayes' eyes found hers, wide with the primal terror of asphyxiation, but underneath that panic was something else. Recognition. His lips moved around a gasped word, "Don't." "Trust me," Rachel said. Her voice dropped an octave, became something without negotiation in it, without room for doubt. Authority the way it arrives when you've already done this 100 times under mortar fire in places that don't exist on any map. Just breathe. She didn't hesitate. The needle went through skin, through muscle, through the wall of his chest like she'd been born to do this singular thing. The sensation of resistance, then the release. The hiss of air escaping, a sound like atmosphere venting from a rupture, like pressure finding its way out of something that was about to break. Hayes's body shuddered. His lungs expanded. His breathing eased from gasping, choking desperation into something resembling oxygen intake. The monitor recalibrated. Oxygen saturation climbing. 65, 72. 81, 88. His heart rate dropped from the 140s down toward something human. The color returned to his face like someone flipping a switch. His hands unclenched from the bedsheets. Colin stared at the chest, at the improvised needle decompression, at the way Rachel's hand remained steady as that same hand reached for gauze to secure it. How did you? Collins's voice cracked. That's not a procedure we're. Floor nurse, Rachel said flatly, not looking up as she taped the pen in place with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd done this before an audience of nothing but sand and the sound of distant explosions. Training program in Houston I did years ago. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the truth. It was exactly the amount of information designed to close questions without answering them, and it worked because Collins's phone was already in her hand, already calling the attending, already reporting a successful needle decompression by the temp nurse in 347. By the time the crash team arrived from the third floor, 30 seconds later, their hands already moving before they crossed the threshold, Rachel had stepped back. She was just the temp. She'd done the obvious thing. She'd responded to crisis. There was nothing spectacular about it. Except the attending physician, a man named Dr. Rivers who'd been at Sacred Heart for 12 years and had never seen a decompression performed outside a surgical suite with anything less than a full surgical team, stopped cold in the doorway. His eyes moved from Hayes to Rachel to the trauma pen to the tape. The question formed on his face before his mouth caught up to it, and Rachel watched him work through the mathematics of what he'd just witnessed. A temp nurse. An improvised needle. A procedure that required knowledge that temp nurses did not possess. Torres, he said carefully. Who taught you that? Navy trauma protocol, Rachel said. Her voice was level. Her hands were absolutely still. Certified in emergency medical intervention. It wasn't a complete answer. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the truth compressed into the smallest possible space, true enough to satisfy a literal reading while concealing the weight of what really lived inside those words. 3 tours. 18 years. More lives saved in darkness than most doctors encountered in a whole career. But the calculation was already happening behind Rivers's eyes, and it was exactly the wrong moment for calculations, because the door opened again and Dr. Hargrove appeared in the frame. His eyes took in the scene, Hayes breathing normally, the trauma pen secured, the attending physician standing motionless with his mouth slightly open, the floor nurse's hand trembling as she tried to document what had just happened. Rachel watched Hargrove's expression cycle through surprise to calculation to something cold and surgical in its own right. Not concern for the patient. Not professional curiosity. The look of a man who'd just watched his liability take control of an emergency and succeed. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket with the deliberate slowness of someone making a decision. His fingers moved across the screen while his eyes stayed fixed on Rachel, not quite a threat, not quite an acknowledgement, something closer to the gaze a predator reserves for prey that's just revealed it has teeth. Everyone out, he said quietly. Except Torres. My office. Now. Hayes's hand moved, gripping Rachel's wrist with the strength of someone still in active survival mode. His eyes held hers, and she saw something shift in them, recognition becoming something sharper. Senior Chief, he whispered. The words came out barely audible, a question wrapped around a name that belonged to somebody else, somebody from a life that was supposed to stay buried. Rachel's jaw tightened. She shook her head once, a warning so small only he could read it, but the damage was done. Hargrove's phone had frozen mid-keystroke. The attending was suddenly very focused on the monitors. The floor nurse had found something urgent to do in the corner of the room. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove's smile arrived, and it was the smile of a man who just caught the scent of something far more valuable than a kickback scheme. "My office, Torres. We need to talk about your credentials." Rachel released Hayes's hand gently and straightened. Her posture shifted, shoulders back, spine aligned, hands moving to her sides with the kind of precision that came from standing at attention for so many years it became muscle memory. It was a small thing. Almost invisible. But it was the moment the mask began to slip, and she could feel the weight of every eye in that room landing on her like she was suddenly transparent. She didn't look at Hargrove. She looked at Hayes instead, meeting his eyes for just a moment, long enough to communicate everything that couldn't be spoken aloud. "Not yet. Not here." She turned and walked toward the door with the gait of someone who'd marched through places most people would never know existed, and she understood with absolute clarity that whatever happened next was going to change the trajectory of everything. Dr. Hargrove's office was on the administrative wing's 3rd floor, a corner space with windows overlooking the parking lot where ambulances arrived like mechanical birds of prey. He sat behind a mahogany desk, 6 feet wide, deliberately imposing, and watched Rachel through the glass partition as security walked her down the corridor. His fingers moved across the phone with the precision of a conductor commanding an orchestra he'd spent years assembling. 3 calls. That was all it took. The first went to Dr. Marcus Sterling, the board's chief of medicine, a man who'd accepted $40,000 in consulting fees for equipment he'd never consulted on. "Marcus, it's Hargrove. We have a credentialing problem." The temp nurse from staffing, Torres, she performed an unauthorized procedure in Hayes's room. No attending present. Used her own equipment. "I'm documenting it now." A pause. The sound of Sterling's breathing changing. "I know. Liability nightmare. I'm already moving on containment." Click. The second call went to Administrative Director Catherine Wells, who owed Hargrove a favor because he'd written her a letter of recommendation when her daughter applied to medical school. He didn't mention that in the call. He didn't need to. "Catherine, I need you to formally request an independent investigator review Torres's credentials and conduct. She's operating beyond scope. I'm concerned about patient safety." The words came easy, patient safety always did. Patient safety was a magic phrase that made people move fast and ask fewer questions. The third call was to his contact at the staffing agency, a contract administrator named Derek who handled physician relationships. "Derek, we need to discuss the temp nurse you sent us. Torres. Her performance is below standard. Insubordination, overstepping protocols, creating conflict with attending physicians. I'd recommend reassignment before this escalates." He let the silence hang. Derek understood the subtext. If Torres didn't leave quietly, future staffing contracts with Sacred Heart might become harder to secure. All 3 calls lasted under 4 minutes total. By the time Rachel reached the administrative wing, the machinery was already grinding. Hargrove watched from his office doorway as the independent investigator, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the demeanor of someone auditing tax returns, intercepted her near the break room. "Ms. Torres? I'm Dr. Stephen Pierce from Compliance Review. I need to ask you some questions about your actions in ICU room 347 this morning." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the moment Hargrove had been anticipating. The trap springing. She couldn't defend herself without explaining the needle decompression. She couldn't explain the needle decompression without revealing she knew exactly what she was doing. And if she admitted she knew exactly what she was doing, she'd have to explain how a temporary nursing assistant had the training to perform an emergency thoracostomy. "Of course," she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat, but Hargrove saw what the others didn't, the way her hands curled into fists at her sides, then slowly released. The interrogation took 17 minutes. Hargrove monitored it from the observation room's video feed, watching Pierce's expression shift from casual inquiry to sharp skepticism as Rachel's answers revealed the impossible. She knew the precise anatomical landmarks, the equipment specifications, the timing required for a successful decompression. Every answer made her look simultaneously more qualified and more culpable. "Where did you receive this training?" Pierce asked, pen hovering over his notepad. "Various clinical rotations." "Which hospitals?" "Multiple institutions." The vagueness was perfect. It revealed nothing and suggested everything. By not lying, she was lying through omission. By refusing to elaborate, she was confirming that something was being hidden. Hargrove understood the architecture of bureaucratic destruction. You didn't need truth. You needed the appearance of wrongdoing and the appearance of cover-up. Within 2 hours, Pierce's preliminary report landed in Catherine Wells's inbox. 23 pages. The conclusion was 14 lines long and damning. The subject nurse performed invasive procedures beyond her credentialed scope of practice without attending physician authorization. Subject's credentials contain inconsistencies and cannot be verified through standard channels. Recommend immediate removal pending full investigation. Catherine called Hargrove at 3:38 p.m. "We have to let her go." "I agree. Patient safety has to come first." He could hear the relief in her voice. He was absolving her of guilt by volunteering for the difficult decision. "I'll handle it myself if you'd like. I'm the attending on her cases." He was in room 347 when they terminated her. Security was already waiting in the hallway with a cardboard box, a termination letter, and the hollow look of people who'd performed this function 100 times before. Hayes was asleep, post-operative sedation still keeping him tethered to unconsciousness. Hargrove had made sure of that. "Rachel, my office. Now." The command was casual, almost friendly. The kind of tone that made people comply without thinking they had a choice. His office smelled like leather and expensive cologne. Rachel stood while he sat. The power dynamic was intentional, geometric, calculated. He tented his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture borrowed from psychiatry textbooks, meant to convey both thoughtfulness and authority. "You performed an unsanctioned procedure without attending authorization." His voice was reasonable, measured. The voice of someone who was genuinely concerned about protocol. "You used personal equipment not hospital approved. You put this institution at enormous liability risk." "I saved his life." Rachel's response was automatic, defensive. The first crack in her professional composure. Hargrove filed that away. Emotion made people vulnerable. The crash team was 6 minutes out. The pneumothorax would have. "You overstepped." He cut her off with the precision of a scalpel. Not angry. Never angry. Disappointment was more effective. "The investigator's report on your credentials came back this afternoon. Your references don't check out. Your previous employer has no record of you. The Joint Commission database doesn't list any nursing certifications under your name. Who are you, really?" The silence that followed was the sound of a trap closing. Rachel's jaw clenched. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. Hargrove watched the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was trapped between truth and oblivion. If she told him, she was admitting to something. If she didn't, she was confirming his suspicions. "I can't discuss my previous work," she said finally. "You can't. Or you won't. Both." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man holding all the cards and watching the other player finally understand the game. "Security will escort you from the building. All hospital property will be surrendered. You're terminated effective immediately for breach of credentialing standards and violation of scope of practice protocols. We'll be reporting this to the State Nursing Board. Your staffing agency has already been notified." He watched her face during that last sentence. The smallest flicker, something between resignation and understanding. She'd known this was coming. But knowing and experiencing were different things. The security guard, Jenkins, a man who'd worked Sacred Heart's doors for 8 years, handed Rachel the cardboard box in the hallway. Inside were her personal effects, a water bottle, a paperback mystery novel with worn corners, a photograph of a sunset over water. That was all she'd brought to Sacred Heart. That was all she was leaving with. "I'm sorry," Jenkins said quietly. He'd worked security long enough to recognize when the wrong person was being asked to leave. Rachel didn't respond. She walked through the ICU one final time, past the patient rooms where people were fighting for their next breath, fighting for their next day, fighting for some version of a future they could touch. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless drone. The monitors beeped their mechanical rituals. Everything continued. Everything moved forward. Everyone replaced. She passed room 347. Sergeant Hayes was still sedated, his vital signs scrolling across the monitor in green numbers. 92 beats per minute. Blood pressure stable at 118/76. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. He was going to make it. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. Her hand paused on the door frame. Just for a moment. Just long enough for her to ensure the monitor was still climbing, still heading in the right direction. The ventilator was quiet. He'd been extubated that morning. His own lungs were doing the work now. His own body was healing itself. Jenkins was waiting by the elevators. Rachel turned away from the room and walked toward him, the cardboard box balanced in her arms like something precious, something she was protecting. The parking lot was rain-slicked, the asphalt reflecting the gray Houston sky in dark pools. She sat in her truck for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, not moving. Not crying. The trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint, the kind that comes from holding something back that wants desperately to break free. 3 days later, she sat in a Veterans Affairs facility in Houston, not as a provider but as a patient. The waiting room was crowded with the unmistakable geography of suffering, a Marine with one leg elevated on a crutch, his prosthetic resting against the wall beside him, an Army Ranger with burn scars that ran from his jaw to his collarbone, a sailor with a prosthetic arm, the mechanical fingers occasionally catching light. These were her people. These were the ones she recognized in her bones. A young corpsman called her name. She stood and followed him down a beige corridor, past examination rooms, past the accumulated evidence of bodies that had been broken and were being slowly, methodically reassembled. "Chief, we're going to need you to schedule for the neuroimaging," the corpsman said, reviewing her chart. "The shrapnel near your spine, we need to assess whether it's pressing on any nerve bundles. You mentioned chronic pain, radiating down your left leg." "Yes." "How long?" 18 years. The corpsman didn't look up from the chart. In a VA hospital, 18 years was just another Tuesday. Hundreds of men and women had carried shrapnel and pain and silence for longer. "We'll get you in within the week. In the meantime, I want you to start physical therapy. 3 times a week. And we need to talk about pain management options." She nodded. Pain was information. Pain was data. Pain was the body keeping score of debts it was owed. She was gathering her discharge paperwork when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. These days, unknown numbers meant bad news or bill collectors or both. "Is this Rachel Torres?" A man's voice. Not hostile. Not friendly either. Professional. Military clean. Speaking. "This is Captain James Mitchell, SEAL Team 7 Command. We need to talk about what happened at Sacred Heart Hospital." Everything stopped. The fluorescent light seemed to dim. The VA hospital sounds, the beeping monitors, the rolling wheelchairs, the distant code announcements faded into background noise. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." Sergeant Hayes made a report. He said a woman saved his life, and then his hospital fired her for it. He also said she used to be one of ours. That she disappeared about 18 years ago. Rachel's free hand pressed against her scar, the one on her spine, hidden beneath her jacket, beneath her scrubs, beneath 18 years of pretending it didn't exist. Sergeant Hayes is recovering well. He's more than recovered, Chief. He's singing like a bird. And I'm calling because when a SEAL Team 7 operator starts singing about a senior chief petty officer who was Black Ops erased, the word tends to travel. Especially when that operator says she just saved his life. The waiting room was crowded with people in pain. Rachel was standing among them, holding her medical paperwork, holding her cardboard box of hospital belongings, holding 18 years of silence in her throat. "What do you need from me, sir?" "We need you to come to a meeting," Mitchell said. "It's time to bring you in. It's time to stop hiding. Some people found out about Sacred Heart. About the fraud. About the equipment kickbacks. And some people want to make sure the person who exposed it gets protected." "I didn't expose anything, sir." "Not yet," Mitchell said. "But you're about to." The elderly man wheeled into Sacred Heart's ER 1 week later was listed on the admission form as a cardiac referral, but the moment he saw Rachel standing in the trauma bay, his eyes went wide and he began shouting in Pashto, then broken English, You are the woman soldier. Sanjin. The school. The children." His voice cracked with recognition and something deeper, the weight of 20 years finally finding its owner. Rachel froze, her hand suspended over a patient chart, because very few people in Houston knew what happened at that school in Helmand Province, and fewer still would connect that moment to a temp nurse in scrubs standing under fluorescent lights that hummed their endless mechanical song. Sergeant Hayes, present for his scheduled follow-up appointment 3 doors down, heard the commotion and stepped into the hallway. The moment he heard Rachel's name spoken aloud in that Afghan accent, something shifted behind his eyes, the same look a combat veteran gets when the past walks out of the shadows and becomes flesh. He approached slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to never startle people with weapons. When he reached the trauma bay, he stood in the doorway and said 3 words that changed everything: "Senior Chief." "Is that you?" Rachel turned. The chart fell from her hands. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. What she did was worse, she met his eyes with absolute clarity, and in that moment, every piece of her carefully constructed invisibility shattered like ballistic glass under impact. Hazy's face went pale beneath his tactical beard, and he stepped forward, extending his hand. She took it. His grip was steady but his voice wavered. "I was 6 years old. Sanjin Valley. You pulled me from rubble." Not a question. A statement of fact he'd carried for 2 decades. The commotion drew the hospital administrator, Dr. Chen, into the hallway. She was followed by 2 men in dark suits who'd arrived at Sacred Heart's administrative office exactly 18 minutes prior with a briefcase, a warrant, and a mandate from the FBI. But before they could introduce themselves, the SEAL commander walked through the automatic doors, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, and asked to speak to Rachel Torres immediately. Dr. Chen's face went from curious to confused to catastrophically concerned in the span of a breath. The administrator's office became the stage. The SEAL commander, Captain Mitchell Graves, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, stood opposite Dr. Hargrove with a folder the color of aged manila and the weight of declassified history. Hargrove's face was already drained, already sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the physics of Sacred Heart Hospital. Captain Graves opened the folder with the deliberate precision of a man who'd done this before. "Navy Cross," Graves said quietly. "Not a statement. A monument." Hargrove's jaw tightened. 2 silver stars. Graves turned the page. Hargrove's hands began to shake. Presidential Unit Citation. Graves closed the folder. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres. 23 years of active service. 78 operations across 4 continents. 4,847 lives touched by her medical care. The last 3 years of her service record were classified. Black Ops Extraction Team. Yemen. The operation that never happened. The woman who never existed. Hargrove stood. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The same mouth that had ordered her humiliation, orchestrated her termination, engineered her removal from his hospital, all because a woman with careful hands and sharper eyes had threatened his PharmaCorp commission structure by simply doing her job with integrity. All because she'd noticed outdated defibrillators being billed as new equipment. All because she wouldn't look the other way. The FBI agents entered without knocking. Special Agent Morrison had a photograph of Hargrove meeting with PharmaCorp representatives at the Montrose Country Club. She had bank statements showing $847,000 moved through an offshore account registered to a shell company Hargrove's brother-in-law controlled. She had invoices for equipment never delivered and billing codes for procedures never performed. She had the email thread where Hargrove explicitly instructed a board member to neutralize the temp nurse before she filed any compliance reports. She had the recording of his call to the staffing agency requesting they fabricate credential concerns. "You're under investigation for healthcare fraud, kickback schemes, and conspiracy," Morrison said. It wasn't a question. "You have the right to remain silent." Hargrove looked toward the doorway where Rachel stood, watching without expression. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood in her scrubs with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned long ago that victory needs no audience. The same security guard who'd handed her a cardboard box of termination papers 6 days ago now approached Hargrove with an identical box. The symmetry was cruel and perfect. "Your personal items, sir," the guard said. "I believe you know the way out." Hargrove's authority evaporated with each step toward the service elevator. His position at Sacred Heart, the board seat, the consulting fees, the network of physicians who owed him favors, all of it dissolved like salt in water the moment the FBI badge appeared. By the time he reached the basement level, 3 board members had already issued statements distancing themselves from any knowledge of equipment contracts. Kenneth Roth had left Houston for a medical conference that suddenly became permanent. The outside investigator Hargrove hired to fabricate Rachel's credential concerns was now facing federal questions about who'd paid him and how much. 6 months later, Rachel Torres stood in the East Room of the White House in full dress uniform. The Navy cross hung heavy and real around her neck. The president had just pinned it to her chest, and now she wore the silver stars as well, 2 medals for actions that couldn't be named, for operations that never officially occurred, for lives saved in places that didn't exist on any map. Sergeant Hayes stood in the audience section, tears streaming down his face, his own service dress uniform crisp and precise. The elderly Afghan man sat in a wheelchair nearby, brought by State Department representatives because some stories transcend borders and language and time. When Rachel was offered the microphone, she stood in silence for 7 seconds. The kind of silence that carries weight. "I served with the best," she finally said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "I was honored to serve the innocent. And I'm grateful to be recognized. But the real heroes are the ones who never made it home." 2 sentences. No more. It was all that needed to be said. Her office at Sacred Heart now bore the title, Director of Veterans Care Services. Hayes's childhood drawing, the crayon rendering of an angel with a medical bag, the one he'd made in a field hospital 20 years ago, hung framed on her wall. Every day she looked at that drawing and understood the mathematics of rescue. The 6-year-old boy she'd shielded from shrapnel had become the warrior who shielded her from erasure. The circle completed itself not with fanfare but with the quiet knowledge that no rescue is ever wasted, and that sometimes the people we save return decades later to save us in turn. The epilogue came on a Tuesday in the Houston heat. Rachel was reviewing staffing schedules when her assistant mentioned that a man was selling supplemental insurance from a folding table outside the strip mall across the street. Rachel glanced out the window and saw Dr. Hargrove sitting beneath a pop-up canopy, pamphlets stacked in neat rows, a clipboard in his lap, the sun beating down on his shoulders like judgment. She felt no satisfaction. Only sadness for what he'd chosen, for the empire he'd built on compromises that crumbled when pressure was applied. She turned back to her work and never looked at that strip mall again. That evening, Rachel spoke to a room of new nurses at Sacred Heart's orientation. 43 faces, mostly young, mostly eager, all of them facing a profession that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. She stood at the podium without notes, without slides, just a woman in scrubs and the invisible weight of service that never gets reported. "You'll face people who mistake kindness for weakness," she said. "Compassion for incompetence. People who'll test you because they think you're small or easy or invisible. Remember this, true class is what you do when the lights go out." In the back row, Hayes sat with 3 other veterans Rachel had saved over the years, tracked down through her network, brought to Sacred Heart's care, given a second chance by someone who understood that healing isn't about erasing trauma but about learning to carry it with purpose. They were her family now. The family built not by blood but by the code she'd lived, leave no one behind. The final image was Rachel walking the ICU at night, checking on patients with the same quiet efficiency as the beginning, but now the staff nodded with respect as she passed. A young temp nurse, nervous and unsure, approached her near the supply closet. "How do you do it?" the woman asked. "Stay confident when everyone else seems to know more." Rachel paused. She remembered her own first weeks, the humiliation, the invisibility. She saw herself in this woman's eyes. "You belong here," Rachel said. "Don't let anyone tell you different. The ones who know their worth don't need to announce it." And that was the real victory, not the Navy Cross, not the reinstatement, not the White House ceremony. The victory was in the next generation of nurses who'd never know her full story, who'd simply receive the gift of her confidence and carry it forward into their own impossible moments, their own battles against indifference. The ones who would save lives because someone had once told them they were enough. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.